Hey, I'm Jim Levinson, Dean of the Yale-Jackson School of Global Affairs. I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar. Topic today is to fill you in on the joint Jackson SOM, the joint degree program that we run. I'm joined today by three of our joint degree students, Josh Lamb, Yehemba Yekona, and Francis Klimczak. They're going to introduce themselves in just a second, but we've carefully got, I think, all the permutations here. The joint degree program typically has someone, you would do 1 year at Jackson, 1 year at SOM, although the order of that is flexible. And then, I said that wrong. You do 1 year at Jackson, you would then do 1 year at SOM, or the other way around, 1 year at SOM, 1 year at Jackson, and then the third year you sort of are joint between the two. And all of the permutations I think are covered. Francis was at SOM last year and is at Jackson this year. Yehemba was at Jackson last year, now at SOM, and Josh is a third year student. So maybe we'll go around and the students can all introduce themselves. Maybe you could, since your names are already up here, sort of, what were you doing prior to coming to Jackson or SOM, things along those lines, a little bit of background. Francis, you want to kick it off?
Sure. Thanks, Jim. Hi, everybody. My name is Francis, and as Jim mentioned, I am a second of 2 years in the joint degree program, doing my first year at Jackson right now. And prior to coming to Yale, I was active duty Navy. I served 8 years. I was in the 7th Fleet area of operations mostly, so spent a lot of time on the West Coast, and then was in DC at the Pentagon right before coming to SOM for my first year. And I really wanted to translate the leadership skills I had gained into something I'm more passionate about, and maybe start my own business. So that's what appealed to me about business school. And through that journey last year, I realized that small business coupled with policies at the community level, local levels, to elevate opportunities for all people was something that spoke to me. So I started at Jackson in the fall. Happy to be here.
Great. Yehemba?
Thank you, Jim. Hi, everyone. My name is Yehemba, second year joint degree student. As Jim has already mentioned, I grew up in the DC area, and prior to starting graduate school, I was working in international development. So I started off my career working at a girls' education organization in Guatemala. Really enjoyed that experience, but realized that I also wanted to learn more about development from the US perspective. So I returned to the US, and I most recently was working for the US Agency for International Development for a government partnership called Power Africa that focuses on doubling energy access in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm really excited that you guys are on the call. I'm always excited at the prospect of more joint degrees.
Josh.
Cool. Thank you, Jim. My name is Josh. As Jim mentioned, I'm a third year joint degree student at Jackson SOM. Originally from Hong Kong and Australia, I grew up in both places, did my undergrad studies in the US, where I studied economics and public policy. And before Yale, I was also in the international development sector. I was working at ID Insight, which was a nonprofit that focused on generating evidence to advise various social sector organizations. I was based in Johannesburg, South Africa for 2 years, but traveled for my work, and decided to apply to the joint degree because I wanted to pivot into the tech policy space, and happy to talk more about that later. But happy to be here. Great to meet you all.
Cool. So I think what I'll do is say a little bit about Jackson, and then sort of turn it back and ask each of the joint degree students a few questions. So by way of background for Jackson, the Yale-Jackson School of Global Affairs is a standalone school of international affairs. We were an institute until this year. We're now Yale's newest standalone school. The last time Yale created a school was, in fact, the School of Management. So it's kind of cool that now we're doing a call having to do with joint degree students at what turns out to be Yale's newest two schools. That said, Jackson has been around for 12 years as an institute. And even as an institute, we conveyed our own degrees. The program at Jackson, how would I describe it? We compete in terms of sort of the space we work in. You know, our peers would be schools such as the Kennedy School at Harvard, or the School of Public and International Affairs, previously known as the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. A difference between Jackson and those two great programs is that Jackson only is in the international side of policy. So students who are interested in issues around international development, international security, international business, climate policy as it speaks to international concerns, you know, that's clearly in our wheelhouse. A student who really wants to understand welfare reform in Wisconsin, that's just not what we do. So we're focused on the international side of policy. Jackson is a pretty small and it's turned out to be a highly selective program. An incoming class at Jackson is typically going to be around 35 to 40 MPP students. That's inclusive of, you know, folks who may be doing dual degrees. Students tend to have a fair amount of experience. You heard from Josh, Yahemba, and Francis. They're pretty typical in many ways. The students who end up coming to Jackson, I think the median age is somewhere around 27, 28, something like that. We draw students from around the world. Being small, it's the kind of place everybody knows everybody. Classes, you know, the largest Jackson class you'll take will probably have, well, 35 or 40 students in it. And many of our classes are much smaller seminars. In terms of faculty, Jackson draws its faculty, they're typically jointly appointed throughout the university. So economist or history professor or political scientist or someone working in global health would have part of their appointment at Jackson. They'd be your professors, but they'll also be teaching some of their time in some of the other schools. One of the things that's a little different about Jackson relative to some of our peers is something we call our Senior Fellows program. These are practitioners who actually teach courses. It's really common in schools of public policy to have a great list of people who come in and give a lecture at 4 p.m. and then they're on the Acela or on the way to the airport by 8. All of our senior fellows teach semester-long courses. And, you know, it turns out that that's a little uncommon. The list of our senior fellows is on our website. It's a great list of people. The senior fellows are thrilled to be at Yale and to teach. They spend a lot of time with their students. History has shown that they're also hugely helpful in terms of networking because obviously they're quite accomplished in their fields and are well established. You know, if we were creating a law school and didn't hire any lawyers, you'd think we were crazy. If we were creating a med school and didn't hire doctors, you'd think we were crazy or, you know, criminally liable. But it turns out in policy schools, you can create a policy school and not actually hire policy practitioners. And people think, yeah, okay. But we at Jackson, you know, think that the practical and the academic mix together in a really nice way. I should put up front on the financial side, Jackson is pretty close to tuition free. Meaning if you get in and ask for a tuition waiver, you'll get it. So we fund our students. We feel that, you know, we want people to leave here on the Jackson side with no debt. So that's important to us. We can get into some more admission stuff. I want to kind of give you the high level stuff now. You'll have a chance, folks who are joining, to ask questions later on. But why don't I start to turn it to our panelists. we'll go in reverse order as last time. So Josh, you're up. And the rest of you, I'm going to ask exactly the same question. Maybe you could say a little bit about what drew you to the joint degree program.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the outset, I'm very interested in tech policy, specifically ways to combat online misinformation and disinformation. And this was inspired partly by, 2019, there were the protests in my hometown of Hong Kong, and I witnessed a lot of propaganda and disinformation affecting friends and family. And so really wanted to pivot into the space, applied to the joint degree program at the outset. So applied to both SOM and Jackson at the same time. Although some people, as you'll hear later on, you can apply to one school and then apply to the other school during your first year. But I applied to both at the outset. And the reason being that my theory was that in order to enact change in the tech policy space, you really have to be within one of these large tech companies that have so much influence over our society. And in order to get those roles, you really need an understanding of both the policy space and also how these companies do business. And so at Jackson, I've been taking classes on online misinformation, disinformation, cybersecurity, tech policy. And at SOM, I've really focused my time learning business strategy, specifically in the tech sector, and also leveraging SOM's pretty robust career development resources to get practical experience at some of these tech companies over the summer. And so I really think that the joint degree has prepared me well for my particular focus, which is working within the private sector to try and help make these technology companies more responsible to society.
Thanks, Josh. Ihemba.
Yeah, so where to start? I guess I'll first of all start by saying that I, similar to Josh, also applied to joint degree programs all at the same time. And so I was essentially every institution where I applied to a business school, I also applied to a policy school. So just wanted to mention that at the outset. I started off my journey though, thinking that I was just going to look at business schools. I knew that given my background, since I was working in international development and I had studied political science in undergrad with an international focus, I knew that the policy piece would kind of be an easy conclusion, I guess, like it would make a lot of sense. But as I was working, I realized that when I worked in Guatemala, I loved the impact I was seeing every day. But it was a small nonprofit organization that focused on, or that was very reliant on individual donors and money from foundations. And I started thinking a lot about how I did not want to be a fundraiser. And then also wondering more about sustainable management of organizations and how can we find access to capital. So that's kind of when the business school seed was planted. And then when I worked at the US Agency for International Development, USAID, the Power Africa is governments and other players like the World Bank, but then also more than 150 private sector companies. And I really enjoyed the partnership across sectors. And I realized that I really wanted to see how that could be done better. And so that's what led me to looking at business school programs. But as I was looking at the programs in the US, I found them all either, I got the feeling from their websites and different events that they were too US centric, or that, they all have social impact on their websites these days. But I started to wonder, how real is that? And so then I ended up adding the policy piece back in, because what had stopped me before was thinking like, oh, that's a lot of time. But then I realized that I knew I wanted to do it and I'd rather not regret later. And so I applied. And I think in terms of why Yale specifically, like why Jackson SOM was the business school where I felt that I could be the most me. I think just in terms of being able to learn about business, but then also really honoring, my social impact interests and just my background that I was coming from. And then in terms of Jackson's flexibility in terms of the curriculum, just not having many core courses, really allowed me to explore what I wanted to with the joint degree, which is the intersection of business and international development. So I'm just I want to stay in the development space long term, and just very interested in, how can we be innovating and how can we work better across sectors?
Hey, thanks. Francis, why the joint degree for you?
Yeah, kind of similar to Yahemba, I'll just take her thread there about the flexibility. Part of the reason I applied to Yale SOM first was because of the flexibility of applying to Jackson in your first year. And for me as a veteran, the pathway from active duty to business school is pretty tried and true. So I felt like maybe that was going to be the right move and open the most doors. But I specifically chose Yale SOM for two reasons relevant to this conversation. The first being its social impact emphasis and cultivating the whole leader, the whole person, the network of people who are really passionate about changing the world in a positive way, which really felt right to me. And then again, the flexibility to apply to Jackson partway through my first year, if that made sense. So I really liked that aspect, and Jackson was a natural fit, like Yahemba said, because of its flexibility. It just helps me build upon that business curriculum and look at how policies and businesses interact, governments and major corporations, those two sets of institutions, what they do to impact the world around them. And for me, I have a lot of experience as a female leader in a male-dominated space. And that's something that I'm passionate about, is empowering other women to lead. And I want to find a way to connect business and policy to do that in a more to have a broader effect, because I find often that business alone might train women well in that one industry, but it doesn't really impact the community. And then to Yahemba's point, like nonprofits and NGOs and even some policies fall short just because of all the trade-offs that have to be made. So how can we expand both to empower women to be leaders? And that's something I'm looking at. I actually spent my summer with a senior fellow, Chris Fussell in West Virginia, looking at how small businesses contribute to community development and empowering youth specifically. And I'm hoping this summer to take that into a more global setting and see how local grassroots organizations all over the world do the same thing.
Hey, Francis, that segues really nicely into the next thing I wanted to ask about. Jackson, like SOM, is a professional school. We realize that our students are taking time away from jobs. They're doing interesting stuff already. There's an opportunity cost, and moving their careers forward is really, really important. It's why we do what we do. I'd like to sort of ask Josh and Yahemba to follow up on what Francis said in terms of what were you doing for interns? Josh, you've had 2 summers to do internships. Both Jackson and SOM work hard to sort of make opportunities available. Maybe Josh, you could say a little bit about what you were doing for your summer internships, plural, and then Yahemba, what were you doing this summer?
Cool. Yeah, so I can talk about both my internships, and I think it's nice because I think the 2 internships kind of reflect the dual strengths of the joint degree program in a way. So my first internship was much more, I guess, policy research flavored. I worked as a research assistant for a professor who was formerly at Jackson, Nathaniel Raymond, doing research on the effects of social media and how it interacts with political violence, specifically focusing on the case study of Myanmar. And so I was part of a research group at Yale working with a couple of other students to try and gather evidence on what happened in Myanmar in the mid-2010s, how social media companies interacted with the local culture and context, and what the risks that arose and potential solutions coming out of that to prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future. And then my second summer, this past summer, I spent in the private sector. So I was working at Google. I was on the trust and safety team, which is the team responsible for protecting users. And I was working on helping develop policies around, I was on the Google Ads trust and safety team. So working on the Google Ads product. So you can imagine ads that run before YouTube videos, search ads, also banner ads on top of websites, and helping them develop policies around political misinformation, specifically around election ads. And so that combined a lot of my the classes that I took at Jackson, my knowledge of democracy and how elections work and risks around political instability, and also kind of understanding how the digital ad market works, and being able to combine those two sets of skills, I thought was very fulfilling and satisfying.
Do you want to say anything about the courses you did at Jackson that fed into that?
Sure, yeah. So
because many of us read about it.
Yeah, I think so. During fall semester of my first year, I took a class with Asha Rangappa, who is at Jackson, former FBI, and she teaches a class on Russian disinformation and misinformation, focusing on the case study of the 2016 elections in the US. And so that was kind of my gateway to understanding how misinformation spreads online. I coupled that with the course, some technical courses. So I took an intro to Python course taught by Casey King, who's at the Jackson School. Also took an intro to computer science course at Yale College. And currently I'm taking a course on computer science and global affairs taught by Ted Wittenstein, focusing on kind of how tech interacts on like the geopolitical level, how the implications of tech for great power competition. And I think those courses are the ones that stand out when it comes to I guess preparing me for this very specific career that I want to enter into.
Cool. Ihemba, you want to say a little bit about summer?
Yes, I love talking about this past summer. Yeah, I had a lot of fun. I was working in Mexico City this past summer at a social enterprise that was very much in the startup phase. So getting started, figuring out what are we doing, how do we convey it, what's the plan, how can we make this work? And the social enterprise, it focuses, or it seeks to address urban poverty in Mexico City, but specifically by trying to fill gaps related to rule of law, economic development, and then also human well-being. So whether you're talking about physical well-being or mental well-being. And there are lots of Jackson connections to this work. So it was started by a former World Fellow who she's a lawyer by training and spent many years working at a very high level and within the Mexican government. And then also, so that was public sector. And then also she worked for many years at General Electric in Mexico. And so, kind of had this public private sector experience, extensive at a high level. And then she's now a social entrepreneur. And I was working for that former World Fellow, and I guess just to back up a little bit. So World Fellows, that is a program at Jackson where there's a small group. I'm forgetting exactly how many. Jim could add in how many people it is, but the way that I usually think about it is it's people who are at the top of their field. So whether they are a human rights lawyer in China, or they're a brand strategist from Turkey, or they work on democracy and governance in Nigeria, they come and they are in residence at Yale for a semester, taking classes, making other connections. And so one of the people who participated in that program years back, she's the one who I was working for this past summer. And I worked alongside other Jackson students, both graduate students, and then there was also a Jackson undergrad actually. And so it was a really great experience because I had, I came in with an interest in social enterprise. And so it was really exciting to be able to test that hypothesis over the summer. And then also Mexico City is just a really fun city. So yeah.
Cool. So I'm going to ask you guys to roll the tape forward. I don't know, 3 to 5 years. What do you think you'll be doing? Josh, you've kind of laid out a pretty clear path. But so maybe I'll kick off with you, and then Ihemba, and then Francis.
Sure, yeah. So I guess, I want to work at the intersection of tech and society, is like the short, pithy one-line sentence. I think to me, having studied kind of this area for now, 2.5 years, I feel like my hypothesis is that there are several ways to make change, all of which have their strengths and weaknesses. You can work on more of on the policy side, helping advise policymakers making these laws that govern how tech can be safer for users. You can work more on the advocacy side in NGOs, or you can work within these big tech companies, creating policy from the inside, like I did this summer at Google. And I think that where I want to start is within these big tech companies, because I think, at least in terms of short-term impact, that's where I can make the most change. But I wouldn't rule out, in 5 to 10 years, perhaps starting my own business, helping advise companies that are working on consumer-facing tech, or perhaps working in an advocacy organization, doing similar work, but more on, trying to push the frontier of how these companies think about ethics.
Cool. Yamba, 3 to 5 years, what are you going to be doing?
I feel like I kind of have two different answers. So 3 years from now, depending on how this upcoming summer goes, I plan to be working in the private sector, doing consulting. I mentioned that part of what drew me, or part of why I'm in the joint degree program, is because I really have this vision of being an international development leader who can speak the languages of the 3 sectors. So how can we really improve development outcomes by leveraging all of the different skills and perspectives of the various sectors? And I have nonprofit experience, public sector experience, but I don't have private sector experience. And so that's really why I'm thinking consulting, just to, gain or learn about different business problems. So that's the 3-year, that's like the short-term vision. And then 5 years from now, I actually don't really have a concrete answer. I want it to be development. I know that I'm extremely passionate about working on women's empowerment. I would love to be doing that. My regional focuses are Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. So I would love to continue doing that. But in terms of what it actually looks like, that's where I'm open when it comes to 5 years from now, just because I think for me within the development sector, I've realized that I really like innovative outcomes. So it could be a social enterprise, it could be some very innovative group within a multilateral or within USAID. I wouldn't mind working there again. And so I think I'm more open about that, just because I think the sector is always changing, and I want to move according to those changes.
Francis, I have to confess that privately, I hope maybe 7 to 10 years from now, I'm getting to vote for you, but 3 to 5, what's the plan?
Oh, thanks, Jim. Yeah, kind of again, echoing Yahemba, it's all going to be dependent on how this upcoming summer goes. And this upcoming summer, I am really hoping to get that public sector experience, kind of figure out where my niche is in the world globally, through this female empowerment lens. But the summer, like I mentioned, I was working with a small business, and it ended up in me creating my own LLC as an independent consultant for the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, where I was working. And I'm helping them with some community development initiatives part-time while I'm in school right now. And I'd love to expand my business into a brick and mortar car garage that empowers young female mechanics in Appalachia, because it's kind of a more conservative place in the US, and a lot of those young women can't find work in the male-dominated industry. And I really relate to that coming from the Navy. So I love this idea of a female-owned and operated car garage in that region, that also has like an attached coffee shop or nail salon to make the experience just better. So I've been noodling on that. I'm in the Startup Founders Practicum at Yale, SOM, really enjoying it. That journey has a lot of ups and downs, but looking to see how this summer, if I can do some minimally viable product launches, but then also look at spending some time abroad with organizations that do similar things, or creating some kind of exchange program for young women to understand how females lead in other global contexts, is something I'm looking at. So yeah, in short, I don't know, because eventually I would also like to have a broader impact. Although I love the small business, small town vibe, I do want to be able to, like Josh and Yahemba have said, have more of a where my social intersection and personal passions interact. I want that to be a little bit more widespread. So time will tell.
Cool. Before we'll open it up to questions in just a little bit. I think maybe I'll add a little bit of perspective on the joint degree program in terms of career options, just because I've now had, about a decade of watching the careers of our joint degree students. And I've got to say, the opportunities have been amazing. I think students coming out of SOM have a lot of just tremendous opportunities. The students coming out of Jackson, because the program is so small and we get just phenomenal students, tend to have, again, an amazing set of opportunities. And when I look at the careers of the joint degree students, people are doing just really, really interesting, impactful stuff. I think the Jackson degree has proved to be a way to differentiate oneself, perhaps from the masses of students with MBAs. And the MBA has been a way to distinguish oneself from the students coming out of a policy program, and to say to potential employers, look, I can also play in the private sector and have the chops to do that. So the mix has been great. Our joint degree alums are working for, they're at Apple, they're at Google, they're at Goldman, they're just doing but when they're at a place like Apple, Google, or Goldman, they tend to be working more in the spaces that Josh laid out, sort of the intersection of policy and policy and business, and probably a little less likely to be doing sort of the standard iBanking kind of thing. So maybe let's switch it up a little bit and start to take some questions from the audience. You can use the Q&A function. I think Maria, you can weigh in if I'm giving people bad advice. Do that a lot. Use the Q&A function to ask questions, and she'll relay those to me. But we want to be able to answer what you have in mind. And if you have a particular person you want to ask your question to, let us know. Otherwise, we'll just kind of throw it out there. So the first question was, someone wrote, everyone seems like such a global citizen. That's kind of true here. But then they followed up and said, is international experience required / preferred for applying to Jackson? Would I be at a disadvantage if I don't have extensive global experiences? I'll take that one. No, you're not at a disadvantage, but you'd want to be able to convey in your application why your interest is, why you're interested in pivoting, as would be the case if you hadn't worked in that space. But we have folks who have done really interesting stuff, and they've worked entirely domestically. I should say about half of the students in an incoming class at Jackson are not from North America. So when I say, they haven't worked internationally, if you grew up in Hong Kong and you worked in Hong Kong, that's domestic. It is true that a lot of our students have international experience. That's kind of the selection, I think, that takes place, but by no means is it sort of required. Let's see. Here's one for the students. Can you talk about how a joint degree student balances their time between the two communities? It's a great question. And maybe and my guess is all three of you are going to have slightly different answers. So Yehemba, you want to kick it off? Francis, you're on deck, and then Josh, you're going to back clean up on this one.
Yes, that is an excellent question. Really excellent. Just because I think, you are not having the same experience as someone who is just doing one program. So you're not all in on one school or the other. And I think, each joint degree student approaches this differently. I think that the approach I took is that in my first year when I was at Jackson, I got some advice from other joint degree students that, your first year be all in at Jackson. And that's what I did because, I knew that I was going to be at SOM this year, but also just because I love the people at Jackson. Like, the people are, by far my absolute favorite part of it. And so I did that, I participated in a club, an impact investing club at the business school. And so I did that and then kind of met some people at the business school and formed some relationships through that. But I really took an approach of, if there's some quality, genuine relationship that I'm forming, I'm not going to be like, no, I'm at Jackson this year, I can't be friends with you. But I definitely focus more on Jackson. And then this year, I think I have been trying to form my community at SOM as well, and make sure that I feel comfortable when I'm, walking through the halls at Evans. But I'm still balancing my Jackson friends as well. So, just trying to do what I can. So, okay, the Jackson school just had its opening ceremony. I'll go there and attend. Or if fun Jackson things are going on over the weekends, I try to do that. And then of course, trying to just, get coffee with Jackson people and just maintain my relationships there.
Francis, you started at SOM and then sort of came to the joint degree in Jackson later. What's your take? How do you balance time?
It is hard. It's kind of funny, but the social life balancing, I think, is actually one of the hardest things at Yale, because there's so many wonderful people, so many wonderful opportunities. You want to go to everything. You won't be bored here ever, that's for sure. And the business school, the way they design the cohorts, and Yehemba and Josh can speak to their experiences as well, but you're in a cohort of about 75 people and then on a small learning team of about 8 people. So in my first year, I became very close in that group of specifically my small learning team, but also in general, like my cohort. And then the business schools also emphasizes networking a lot. So I feel like I've really got to know everybody at SOM, or a big chunk of folks. And then I feel like I also, like Yehemba was saying, I was kind of all in on that and got to experience a wide range of things at Yale, from Harvard-Yale game to some of the more formal events in the spring, which was really, really great. But now at Jackson, I've kind of dialed all that down because I'm in a class of about 35 total. So it's just a much smaller and more intimate environment. And I've been able to right off the bat form much closer relationships with my classmates, and you kind of get to everybody's intention and why they're there right away, which has been, I think, really special. So now I also am like really trying to lean into getting to know these new people and sharing a different side of myself with a different group. And like, again, to Yehemba's point, I still have all my SOM friends. Now it just becomes, I have 2 parties to choose between on a Friday night, or, 2 invitations to 2 different Yale rep events in a week from 2 sets of different people. But it's an embarrassment of riches, so it's all good.
Cool. Here's a question for each of you. Someone asked, there are 2 ways to put this. There's 2 questions that are pretty close. One question is, what was your most noteworthy experience so far in the joint degree program? And then relatedly, someone else asked, what's your favorite course at Yale so far? So why don't we put those 2 together? Favorite experience and noteworthy experience, and then favorite course.
Jim, I don't mind going first, actually, because my answer is the same.
Hey, why don't you kick it off, and then, because that gives Yehemba and then Josh a little time to noodle it over.
Yeah, absolutely. I took last year in the spring, I took SOM's Global Social Entrepreneurship course, which allows you the opportunity to be a social impact consultant for a real company somewhere in the world. And we were in Kenya. So I worked with an organization called Sanergy in Nairobi with a team of about 4 other SOM students, actually students from all over Yale. So Jackson students, YSE students. This is a course open to anyone, and Jackson and SOM students are often make up the bulk of the class. But I got to be on this mixed background team helping this company called Sanergy, which provides sanitation solutions for urban settlements. We got to work on a project for them. It was amazing. We built these relationships with people from Kenya. Then we traveled to Nairobi, spent a week with the company, got to know everybody, and then produced a pretty awesome strategic tool for them And that was just a very rewarding experience. And the traveling and everything was great with the whole class getting to explore Nairobi and larger Kenya during the second week of spring break. So I remember when I was applying to Yale, that was the thing that jumped out at me. So it was so amazing to be able to do that in my first year and for it to exceed all of my expectations, even though I had set such high expectations from the beginning. So highly recommend people look into that class, even through their application process, to just speak to something about Yale that excites you and something about the joint degree that excites you.
Yeah, Yehemba.
I mean, Mexico was quite noteworthy, but to not repeat myself, another experience that I really liked also relates to a class. So last fall, I took ethical choices in public leadership with senior fellow Eric Braverman. And that class is, it brings together an interesting mix of students because it's Jackson students, but then also SOM students and then law school students. And mine, we had a couple of people from the School of Public Health as well. And the focus of that class is essentially, I mean, it's the title, right? Like, how do you make ethical decisions as a public leader? But the way in which we talk about that is through scenarios. So it's based on, so you'll go to a class and then we're talking about quite literally life or death scenarios. So let's say that there is a flood and you have to evacuate people from a hospital. And so how do you decide who you're going to take when you have a limited capacity in terms of what you can do, and just various scenarios of that nature. And I think it was a really great class that I really enjoyed because I've never taken a class like that, but I think it really pushed me to think very critically about how do I make decisions? What are some things I can draw on as I make difficult choices moving forward in my leadership? And so I would just say that was definitely it was a very noteworthy experience. It was one of my favorite classes. And then also just to mention it, just because it's quite popular among Jackson students. And then also it's been interesting too, to be at SOM and hear people talking about it as well.
Yeah, and I should add, Eric Braverman is the CEO of Schmidt Futures. So heads up a very large philanthropy. And any of you who are at Jackson as incoming students, of course, you'll have the opportunity to take a class with Eric, but I believe Eric will be participating in a newly formed orientation. And we'll be doing, Yehemba, exactly with the entire class, the sort of thing that you did in his course. So we're building that into the DNA of the school because I think it is so very important. Josh, favorite class and or favorite experience?
I'll do both in one. So the experience / class that comes to mind was a class I took called Python for Global Affairs, which, as I mentioned earlier, is taught by a faculty member called Casey King. It does what it says on the tin, teaches basic Python in the context of global affairs, so very practical applications. But what I really liked about the class was that the final project was extremely open-ended. And so I collaborated with a classmate to do a final project around scraping data from Twitter and analyzing the data to kind of track the spread of Chinese state propaganda on Twitter. I found the project so interesting, in fact, that I took the class in the spring, and then that summer, simultaneously with my internship, I continued expanding on the project and ended up writing a paper which got published. And some of our data and our results were actually cited in some major publications. And so I guess it just goes to show that, the flexibility of Casey King's class and by extension Jackson allowed me to pursue a topic that I found very personally interesting and that kind of opened some doors when it came to my professional career as well.
And Josh is being modest, okay? Look, his work was covered, I think it was front page New York Times. So pretty cool stuff. Okay, someone asked, here, I'll take the next one. What has changed at Jackson since it became a full professional school? I'll take that. But let me tell you what the one following is so you can start to give it a little bit of thought. How do you find living in New Haven, having lived in so many places around the world? Okay, what's changed at Jackson since it became a school? Resources would be the one word answer. We are hiring, a lot of faculty. We're doubling the size of our faculty. We're really doubling down on for financial aid. I mentioned earlier, we expect to give full tuition waivers to every single student who's admitted. Next fall, I expect us to be moving in. We have to 2 new buildings in addition to the building we have now. Jackson will be occupying what was, in fact, the campus of the School of Management before SOM moved into its new digs a few years back. So our physical footprint will be larger, more courses, more faculty, more aid for our students. Interestingly, one thing that won't change is the very small size of the program. It's 35 to 40 students, and we don't plan to make it a whole lot bigger. I think there's something very special about the type of community that we can create and the type of class we can, at some level, curate by keeping things really small. And we plan to stick with that. So with that, Josh and Yihemba, how do you tell us about New Haven? And it's a great question since you grew up in pretty different kinds of places.
I can go first. Would love to hear your answer as well, Yihemba. New Haven's grown on me. I think I again grew up in Hong Kong, major city, so I had some slight concerns that New Haven would seem quaint when I first arrived. But I think at this point, it's been 2.5 years. I think New Haven is just the right size. I think it's big enough such that you have the restaurants, you have the bars where you can go out, and there's like East Rock Park if you want to go have a walk. There are cool hiking trails within 20 minutes drive. But it's also small enough such that you don't get lost in the city. And so I have some friends who are at, for example, Columbia Business School, and they find that perhaps they find it more challenging to make friends because everyone has their own friend group in New York City. Whereas in New Haven, I think the fact that the city is so small encourages our classes at Jackson and at SOM to bond. And so that's something I appreciate about the city.
I co-sign basically everything that Josh says. I think that, there's a reason why people ask this question. I think I also came into a reason as in I feel like New Haven has this reputation that, oh, maybe you won't like it, or think carefully before you choose to go there. And so I came to New Haven not really knowing what to expect. I was like, okay, let's see how this goes. And New Haven feels like home. I really enjoy it. As I said, I think I totally agree with what Josh has said, just in terms of there are things to do here. And, people don't have a lot of distractions since it's not a gigantic city. One other thing I would add, I guess, that I really, really enjoy about New Haven is that it is so walkable. And so I think I love that I can be in a neighborhood. I live in East Rock, which is where a lot of other grad students live. There are other young professionals. There are professors who live there. I really love that neighborhood. It takes me less than 10 minutes to walk to the business school. But then I also really enjoy that when I am going out to dinner with friends, we tend to walk together. We meet at a certain spot and then we walk, 25 minutes and we're at dinner. And so I think that's probably my favorite thing about New Haven.
Cool. Last question. I'll read this. It comes from one of the participants. What advice do you have for candidates thinking about applying to the joint degree program? What do you wish you had known? Who wants to tackle that first?
I can take a stab at it, and then Yihemba, you can add on. I think there are many differences between the two schools, but one common thread is the focus on impact. And so that's something that I focus on during my application process, is just having a very clear vision of the positive social impact that I wanted to make, and having a theory of change mapped out in my head. For me, it was tech policy. For you, it might be something very different. And being able to articulate that in both kind of application processes. And also, I guess, having a clear rationale as to why having business skills and being able to speak the language of business, but also an understanding of policy, is going to help you achieve whatever goal that you might have. And that takes some introspection.
Yihemba.
Yeah, I think totally agree with having your theory of change, so really knowing why you want to do what you want to do. And then I would emphasize the piece about knowing why you would need a joint degree to do it. I think Yale makes it easy to do it, but I think it's really important to understand your why. And particularly thinking from the Jackson perspective, if you're at Jackson, you can come and be an MPP student and take almost all your classes at SOM anyway. And so really having a reason for why you feel you need the other degree. So I think that that's important. But I think what I wish I had known and what I emphasize to people now and what I want to share with you all today is just be confident in your experiences if you're coming from a non-business background. I think I spent so much time worrying and feeling overwhelmed about how I don't have a business background. Will I get into business school? How am I going to make this work? And I think in all of that time that I spent, I could have applied to at least one other school in that time. And so I would just say, be confident in yourself, lean into your experiences. And I think just on both the Jackson side and the SOM side, grad schools are better when they have people of diverse backgrounds and varied interests. And so I think just lean into that and be confident in what you want to do, and just, show them who you are and be authentic in the application process.
Thanks. I want to thank Josh and Yehemba. I also want to thank, although she's not here, Frances. She had to run off. She had an exam. Maria, thank you for helping put all of this together, and especially to the participants. Thanks for taking the time. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. You can find any of us pretty easily. I'm on the Jackson website, as are Josh and Yehemba. If you have questions at SOM, Maria can help with that. I really would encourage you to apply. I think we have an amazing community here, and I'm sure you would add to that. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.